Hello everyone and welcome to this presentation for BFI Geography Theme 3, focusing on the European Union and its dynamic role in today's globalised world. I'm going to try and take you through some of the key concepts, challenges and policies that shape the EU's place on the international stage. And during this presentation, we'll try and explore how the EU works, how it addresses its regional disparities, how it is trying to confront some of the contemporary challenges like migration and foreign policy, and why it's considered the world's most integrated regional organisation. And by the end of the presentation, hopefully, you'll feel confident about the big picture and about tackling your examination questions on the EU's contributions and constraints in a global context. Just a reminder that this is just an overview presentation. Of course, you need your detailed notes and your specific case study information to support any points, which obviously we don't have time to go through here. So this is just the overview. It's important to see how all of this links, especially to theme 2 of the BFI programme, of which there are two really important key questions, which you can see on the screen there, about the grouping of nations. Is it a cause of unequal territorial integration into global economy? And then also don't forget that although we're talking about a trade bloc, it essentially comes down to the role of the governance at nation state level. So how far do you agree that the role of the state is becoming increasingly limited in this globalized world? And of course, as we know, trade blocs is one of the key issues that could appear in the examination season. So, just to quickly give you a little reminder about trade blocs, they are a global phenomenon. The map on the left there shows you some of the world's major trading blocs. You can see the EU, the one we know so well, at the centre of the map there in dark blue, and the USMCA, the new incarnation of NAFTA, inaugurated by President Trump in his first term of office. And you can see some of the others, including some long-standing, really important trading blocs, such as Mercosur down there in South America. And it's worth remembering that we talk about trade blocs in generality, but they are, of course, are all different, and they can increase in their depth. And that depth of trading relationship is shown by the diagram at the bottom there, where we can start with a very, very light touch of a preferential trade area, and then we can move through free trade areas, through the customs union, and all the way through to economic union, where we find the EU now with its common currency. And then finally, you can actually get full integration, although we don't really consider it that kind of federal integration, like for instance the United States started off as a trading bloc and is now fully integrated into becoming the same nation. So why are they important? Well, they're important to understand because, of course, one of the factors that we notice is that increasing integration into the global economy brings with it increased economic results. And there's a very strong positive correlation between the COF index and gross national product. And as a result, we have to look closely at how these trade blocs work and what advantages they can bring nations. So what I've done here is I've tried to select probably the three main advantages and the three main disadvantages that are often discussed in trade blocs. So in terms of advantages, trade blocs can create larger markets by eliminating or reducing barriers to trade between those member countries. And what that does is it allows businesses to access more consumers. They can achieve that economies of scale, and even in some cases increase specialisation within those markets. And as we know, the EU gives you access to around about 400 million consumers without tariffs or quotas. So the market access in what is in the EU, the world's largest internal market. There's also increased bargaining power on a global scale. So by negotiating as a unified entry, trade bloc members can gain greater leverage in global trade discussions. It was beautifully put to me once by a student who said to me, that what the EU does is allow smaller nations a seat at the main table, which they ordinarily wouldn't have had. So ASEAN, for example, is able to negotiate more favourable trade terms out there in Asia with countries huge economic giants like China and Japan, because they act as a bloc together. And of course, because they're such huge internal markets, they can attract investment. So trade blocs typically attract more FDI, or foreign direct investment, as companies seek to establish their operations within those blocs and to try and access, therefore, that entire regional market. That investment can lead to job creation, transfer of new technologies, and ultimately economic development. And although it's up for debate at the moment, the USMCA, for example, in North America has seen significant cross-border investment flows, with companies looking to establish that regional supply chain across the US, Mexico, and Canada. Of course, trade blocs come with disadvantages. While they can increase trade amongst members, of course, they can at the same time reduce that trade with non-members, even when those outside countries, for instance, could be more efficient or cheaper producers. And that, what we call trade diversion, can lead to economic inefficiency within trade blocs, and can also affect the global economic system and can lead to global welfare losses. For example, EU agricultural policies protect our internal producers, while potentially blocking from our shelves more cost-effective, cheaper, maybe even better quality imports from non-EU countries, and that comes at a cost. There are always those sovereignty concerns. So although your membership of a trade bloc brings advantages, it requires countries to surrender some decision-making authority to those supranational bodies, and that can limit policy autonomy in areas, maybe environmental regulations or labour standards or your own monetary policy. And that was what was behind a lot of the Brexit movement in the UK, which was partly driven by concerns over sovereignty and the amount of regulatory control that was being handed over to Brussels from London. And finally, the benefits of trade blocs are often distributed unevenly. So within the member countries and within the populations, stronger economies or specific sectors often benefit more, which can actually potentially exacerbate regional inequalities and can even cause economic disruption in some less competitive industries. And we see this around the world. For instance, there's big debates in Mercosur in South America whether Brazil's industrial sector is basically taking over and swallowing up through the advantages some of the smaller sectors in some of the other countries like Paraguay, Uruguay, and other member states. So overall, that's probably the three main, I would say, advantages and disadvantages to trade blocs, and it's worth having those in your mind as we try and conceptualize the EU. So to look at the EU, we're basically kind of looking at five main areas to explore. The EU is a block of deep integration, which has created prosperity, certainly within the bloc, but has also increased the visibility, and some would argue increased the depth of inequality, and therefore we have regional disparities. And what that does, it creates a kind of political demand for there to be some kind of redistribution within the EU, which has to be financed and administered, of course. And that's really what many of these policies, such as the CAP, the cohesion funds, and transport projects, aim to reduce. But as these entities grow, they become exposed to shocks, both internally and externally. And there are many, many challenges facing the EU. It's got a big hard power deficit, which means it relies a lot on its economic soft power. And as a result, it's got to have a strong integrated regional economy to exert that power. And in some respects, therefore, the five main aspects of the EU are very much interrelated. And you can think of it as a kind of finely tuned flywheel, if you like, that integration into the bloc spins the whole thing. Regional policy tries to keep that balanced. Global shocks and internal shocks might wobble it. But what happens is it relies, therefore, on its economic muscle, and therefore we come back full circle to it being an integrated economy. We will come across some key terms. What do we mean when we say globalisation? We're talking about that interconnectedness of nations across national boundaries. It covers economics, technology, culture, politics, a lot more. And the European Union goes beyond a simple trade agreement. It's actually a supranational organisation where entities of member states will pool their sovereignty in various aspects. And in the EU, certain decisions are made collectively, which means that individual states surrender a portion of their decision-making power. But one of the core aims of these is territorial cohesion, which involves policies that are designed to support those lagging regions and close that development gap within the EU. And finally, programmes like the Cohesion Fund, the European Social Fund, the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, and others are how the EU puts that vision into practice. And you should be ready to give concrete examples of those programmes at any given point in terms of referencing key aspects of the EU. So let's start with a little snapshot of what the European Union actually is today. And so from Lisbon in the west, Tallinn in the east, from Dublin up in the north, right down to Athens in Greece in the south, there are 27 sovereign states that choose to make common rules and pool their leverage. And you can see them on the map on the right-hand side by their joining date. The candidates in orange, pink are candidate countries to join. You can see over there in the east. The population, we're never too sure exactly what the population is. Debates vary, and it's worth noting that the figures on the screen are projections for 2027 for the future. But at the minute, we think there's around about 400 million people living within the boundaries of the EU, and that's roughly about 1 in every 20 people on Earth. And it's more than the population of the United States, to give you some idea. It's got a GDP of around about $18 trillion or about 16 trillion euros, and that makes it the world's third largest economy by size after the US and China, and it gives Brussels real weight in any kind of negotiations that take place internationally. Integration is, as we've said, an issue. 24 official languages, 60 regional languages, and it's hoped that the EU hopes to try and build a framework that allows goods, services, and talents to move freely within that bloc, but not to erase the diversity that there is within there. So when we talk about single market legislation, trade deals, or climate targets, it's worth keeping those four numbers in mind. 27 countries, 400 million people, 16 trillion euros, 24 different languages. And those are the reasons why EU decisions reverberate far beyond Europe's borders. Now, you might ask, is the EU therefore just a regional club? Or does it actually push globalisation, as you can see from the title of the slide? Is it a globalised entity or is it just a regional entity? Well, the answer to that is probably both. The single market is a classic act of regional integration, lowering borders inside Europe so that companies can scale up and citizens can live, study, and work across those countries as if they were one almost. But precisely because this regional bloc is so large, it wields the clout to shape global rules on trade, climate, increasingly on digital governance. And you can think of things like the EU's carbon neutral carbon border adjustments or the GDPR on data protection. And you can see that standards that were established regionally here in Europe are now seen as worldwide benchmarks. So let's look a little bit more detail about the regional disparities. And you'll see here that not all EU regions are on an equal footing. This is a map of the various development in each of the regions. And this stark contrast in terms of GDP per capita and other measures of economic development, with Western and Northern Europe often enjoying higher incomes, stronger infrastructure, while some of the Eastern and Southern regions lag behind. And a good case in point is that of Germany. Although it's Europe's economic powerhouse for sure, it's got unequal integration internally, with wealthy industrial regions like Bavaria or the Rhine-Ruhr area stand in contrast with some parts of the former Soviet influenced East Germany, where they're still catching up. So the EU's cohesion policy tries to address these imbalances by channeling funds into things like transport upgrades, broadband connectivity, education, job creation in those less developed regions of Germany to try and even things up. So now that we've looked at the differences in development across the EU regions, we need to explore why these disparities exist, and importantly, why territorial cohesion is so central to the EU. And here we need to come back to two key economic theories that help us to understand the regional equalities in the first place, and also why the EU responds to them in the way that they are. And they are the core periphery model, and later we'll look at cumulative causation. So the core periphery model, according to this model, economic development tends to concentrate in certain core areas. They could be major cities, regions, or industrial hubs, while outlying peripheral regions remain less developed. And the core benefits from advantages like better infrastructure, higher skilled workforces, established trade networks, and that reinforces its economic dominance. As a result, the peripheral areas around them struggle to attract any investment and talent, and they risk further marginalisation as goods and people move from the periphery into the core, what we call backwash. And this, unless this is addressed, then the gap between the two can just increase. Now, that's a really, really simple measure. In reality, there's probably not just core and periphery, but semi-peripheral areas, areas that exhibit some aspects of the core, but also some aspects of the periphery, often between urban and rural areas. But certainly in Europe, there's this long-held idea of the blue banana, which is the central core region. Of course, it's worth noting on the map on the screen that that actually goes up into the UK, which is no longer a member of the EU. So the blue banana is probably looking most unsatisfactory in terms of banana-ness at the minute with its truncated nature. So that's the concept of the core and the periphery. And you can see there this idea of the backwash of people and goods and resources leaving the periphery and flooding into the core. Now, what's happening in the core is this idea of cumulative causation, and the famous economist Gunnar Myrdal introduced the idea of cumulative causation, which suggested that once a region has an initial advantage, which could be anything from geographical to climatic to demographic, then what will happen is it will then develop further advantages, let's say new industry or a critical transport hub, and it creates this virtuous cycle of investment, job creation and innovation. And over time, this snowballs, making the region increasingly attractive for business and skilled workers. And that's what's going on in the core. So the core, as you can see, starts to accumulate or snowball and starts to bring in aspects of the periphery through that backwash. Now, what can happen is, of course, the opposite then occurs in peripheral areas where they experience that vicious cycle of disinvestment and brain drain, in particular, the loss of talented young people. And that can exacerbate the inequalities. Now, Myrdal did talk about what they called spread effects, as well as the backwash effects, where the core pulls away resources, talent, and capital from peripheral areas. There is this idea of the spread effect, where the core growth will spill out to benefit other areas. And there's a big debate over how fast that happens, how widespread that happens, how effectively that's happening. And therefore, as a result, the European Union's territorial cohesion policies like the Cohesion Fund, the European Regional Development Fund, are designed to counteract the negative impacts of core periphery dynamics and cumulative causation within the core. And what it helps is to direct funds and development projects into those peripheral areas. In that way, they'll attract investment and improve the infrastructure. They'll retain and develop the human capital by, they try and help education, research, and try and stop brain drain. And it will therefore encourage and facilitate much more widespread and much quicker spillover or spread effects, and promote cooperation between the two, so that the economic spread effects outweigh any backwash effects. And this really highlights the economic rationale behind these EU policies. If those disparities become too large between core and periphery, the entire bloc suffers, including the core, from lower overall economic growth. The core overheats, if you like, it becomes inflationary, costs become too high, it becomes less effective, as well as the increased social tensions you get between those peripheral and core areas. And by reinforcing those less developed areas, the EU actually creates a much more balanced, robust, resilient, stable market. So improving its cohesion then actually enhances its global competitiveness and its ability to attract investment from around the globe. So there we have that kind of linkage between the internal dynamics of the EU and its position as a globalised entity. So its budget, as you can imagine, is substantial, it comes from contributions from member states. So we need to start getting a feel for where this money goes, because the proportions of spending are important. So the cohesion policy, or the cohesion policy trio, the ERDF, the European Regional Development Fund, the Social Fund and the Cohesion Fund, between them, it's almost the same as the agricultural budget. It's about 373 billion in total. And the Regional Development Fund invests roads, broadband, green transition. The Social Fund looks at job skills, social inclusion, and the Cohesion Fund is for those really big ticket transport and cross-border climate projects, particularly in the less wealthier states. So that fund there, you can see that's why the EU dedicates around about just under a third of all of its budget towards balancing out and towards cohesion. Hopefully now you can see its importance. The agricultural policy, which is one of the founding pillars of the EU after the Second World War, which was to try to ensure a sustainable food supply for the continent. Again, about 60 billion a year is spent alone on keeping 6 to 7 million farms afloat, who may well go under. And it's still one of the single biggest line items in the EU budget. So again, together it absorbs about a third of the budget. But also, you know, because it targets rural areas, it's often seen as part of the cohesion almost as well, because it's aimed squarely at reducing those gaps between rural and urban areas. Urban areas often found in to be the core. And then everything else comes to around about 377 billion. And it covers the single market. It's about 37%, covers the single market, covers research, external action, migration, security. You can see there all the various breakdowns: humanitarian aid, Erasmus, studying, justice, human rights. And controversially, within there, a large chunk of it is the running cost of the institutions of the EU, which of course are on top of the cost of running individual nation states, which sometimes attracts some criticism about the money that's potentially maybe being wasted there. So two big blocks dominate the budget, and they are the CAP and the Cohesion Fund, and almost all the remaining policy ambitions of the Union have to share what's left. So whenever new priorities appear, budget debates become a big tug of war between those two giants, if you like, of the EU, cohesion and agriculture, and the everything else bucket, I guess, which is at the bottom. The reason I'm showing you this is to give you some idea of the importance of cohesion to the EU in terms of establishing itself on the global scale. So we now need to look a little bit more at some of the key EU programmes and initiatives that aim to foster cohesion, support economic development and encourage sustainability across those member states. Although the EU's a diverse community of countries, of course, these are overarching policies designed, as we've said before, to bring these regions closer together, to reduce their disparities, and therefore to ensure that they're competitive and have sustainable growth. So first of all, we have the EU cohesion funds themselves. Their financial instruments aim to reduce disparities by investing in infrastructure, employment, innovations, particularly in those regions with lower GDP per capita statistics. For example, the ERDF looks at innovation, the digital economy, small and medium enterprise competitiveness, and some aspects of transitioning to a low carbon economy. And the European Social Fund targets employment opportunities, social inclusion, training, job creation, education, skills, those kind of aspects. So you can see that there are big funds there to be spent in those regions towards cohesion. Transport is also a big cohesion target for the EU, and one of the EU's central strategies is their Trans-European Transport Network, the TEN-T. These networks provide connectivity, as you can see, between those peripheral and core regions that facilitate mobility of goods, people, and also trade. And by funding this critical infrastructure through things like high-speed rail, upgraded highways, modernised ports, the EU again is helping to make remote and less developed areas more attractive for investment by connecting them more closely to the core. We come back to the behemoth of the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, which aims to provide income for farmers, ensure food security, and by spurring that rural development, it becomes a vehicle of cohesion also. It's probably got two main features. The first is its direct payments, and farmers are paid. Financial support is tied to their environmental standards, which is cross compliance. It used to be based on food production, but that led to massive overproduction of cheaper, low quality food. So there was a big change to go towards direct payments, which is more about the way in which food is produced. And with that, there's also funding for rural development programs. So modernising rural areas, diversification of farms, so that it's not just food production, things like rewilding schemes, tourism, and also supporting farmers with environmental stewardship through woodland schemes and clean water programs and helping those rural communities. Obviously, the CAP, I think, more than anything else, attracts criticism. It's been critiqued in the past for encouraging overproduction and disproportionately benefiting those larger agribusinesses. So there are constant reforms taking place that continue to try and focus on better environmental management and a more equitable distribution of subsidies. And you saw maybe last year that didn't go down well. Those reforms aren't going down well here in France. Farmers, particularly in these core regions where they're finding that it's placing additional stresses on costs for them. The European Green Deal is relatively new, 2019. The Green Deal is basically an ambitious plan to make Europe the first climate neutral continent by 2050. As you can see there, that's its core purpose down there in the blue. So it's going to try and cut greenhouse gases, emissions significantly by 2030. They're trying to invest in green technologies, create new jobs in those green energy sectors, and looking to transform industries. You'll see this in public transport, also in agriculture, as we saw, raising costs and causing some controversy there, and even particularly looking at the construction sector. There's also an element of a just transition. So, of course, as we move towards carbon neutrality, it adversely affects certain regions, particularly those, for instance, coal mining regions, fossil fuel regions. So, and of course, inevitably they find themselves in the periphery. And so there's additional support for areas finding themselves hit by those. So it aligns quite nicely with territorial cohesion because it ensures the benefits of transitioning are spread evenly rather than concentrated. And although these programs overall are supposed to illustrate how the EU's policy framework seeks to balance economic competitiveness, environmental sustainability, and that social equity. But it's important when you look at your studies to be able to discuss both the positive outcomes, such as improved infrastructure, reduced economic gaps, greener energy solutions, with all of that fine detail that you need, but also the criticisms of complex bureaucracy. There's still unequal subsidy distribution, And some of these changes and implementations are very cumbersome and slow. And having a balanced viewpoint of all of these programs is going to be really, really important to help you articulate the impact of these on regional development. So we now need to look at some of the challenges facing the European Union, some of them internal, some of them external. Three main internal ones, I guess, are the diversity and fiscal differences, financial differences, and different economies within the EU, migration and how it's coping with migration and asylum policies, looking outwards a little more, foreign and military policy and limitations there. Certainly looking externally at the competition in global trade, which of course has come into stark relief recently, and also enlargement of the EU and what has been the aftermath of probably its most impactful contraction, which was Brexit. So if we take each of these one by one, first of all, these internal fiscal differences, the countries are very, very different. GDP, debt to GDP is around about 60% in the Netherlands. It's about 160% in Greece and Italy. So the idea of a one-size-fits-all budget rule doesn't seem to work. There's been attempts since 2024 reforms to try and bring some fiscal discipline to some countries. Countries like Germany and Finland fear what we call in economics moral hazard, which is that they somehow seem to underwrite the riskiness of other countries, whilst highly indebted countries like Greece fear, vast austerity programs. There are increasingly gaps in the north to south and east to west axes where wage levels, productivity, and inflation can differ sharply. And that makes it really, really complicated for the European Central Bank to have a central policy. And there's even talk about permanent fiscal transfer rules, which is almost like a federal system like they have in the US, where money is permanently siphoned from some areas into others. And people in the US would say, look, Louisiana, which is the poorest state of the United States, but has a GDP equivalent per capita with somewhere like Italy, and they would point to that being a success. Whether that's a step too far, waits to be seen. And also, there are still some issues around what we call rule of law friction, which is that, it's okay handing money over to some governments or like in Hungary with Viktor Orban and previously in Poland with the Justice Party, where you almost have anti-EU parties in charge there. And it underscores how domestic policies can spill into those fiscal decisions. Migration and asylum. There's been a new pact adopted called Concilium, which is aiming to choose, so countries can either choose to relocate migrants within their country, or they can pay into a shared fund. Countries who prefer to pay in feel it's unfair, and countries that are being asked to take relocated migrants also feel it's unfair. But it's aimed to try to distribute the issue away from those states at the south and the east, the already economically disadvantaged states disproportionately affected. So we call it the frontline inland rift. And now there's also an external dimension with the EU investing heavily in countries where these people are predominantly coming through. For instance, Tunisia and Egypt. There's greater naval missions out at sea trying to intercept small boats. But critics say this has got, you risk some pretty serious human rights breaches by treating asylum seekers in this way. And also at the same time, does the EU want migrants? Aging population means that we have greater demand for legal migration pathways. But as we've seen across the continent, populist pressure makes that politically fraught. Most recently, of course, we've had discussions about military and foreign policy limitations. So there's a unanimity handicap. Military and defence issues are one of those things at the moment that require a 27 unanimous vote for anything. And of course, as we said, certain nations in the East, most recently Hungary, have repeatedly delayed sanctions against Russia. And, the the system in the EU, they sometimes call it veto blackmail, which makes moving forward on these issues extremely difficult. The strategic compass in 2022 started to set up a joint threat assessment, and the EU does have a 5,000 troop rapid deployment capacity, but that is incredibly small. And although there's common procurement goals for military weapons, this funding and this readiness is not really effective and in place, and is nowhere near anything, for instance, that NATO has as a benchmark. And obviously, we've seen recently a bit more geopolitical juggling. You know, is the US's focus away from Europe and towards maybe the Indo-Pacific? And as we've seen, war in Ukraine, instability in the EU, in the Sahel, former colonies down there, can lead to us finding our cover increasingly thinner, particularly as the US looks to withdraw. Competition in global trade is also a big challenge. Beijing backs state enterprises in China, electric vehicles, solar, and Washington also has inflation reduction subsidies, and that has forced the EU itself to adopt some protective measures on carbon neutrality, anti-subsidy probes. For instance, they placed tariffs on electric vehicles coming from China in response. And also there's issues about supply chain security. For instance, semiconductor production. The EU is trying to get to 20% of a global share of semiconductor production by 2030. And therefore that means they have to establish critical raw mineral strategies. And that, of course, leads them into the murky world of transnational corporations and extractive industries in economically less developed countries. So although the EU sometimes shows itself to be a world leader in setting rules, for instance GDPR, there's some debate as to whether they are in a position to compete in the market. And as we saw, the energy shock and the gas price spike showed that vulnerability to having external suppliers, and prompted a move towards renewables. So there is global competition elements for the EU, particularly China and the US, and of course enlargement. There's looking at enlargement in the Western Balkans, maybe even Ukraine and Moldova. It's going to be a €6 billion plan. Albania and North Macedonia also in discussions. Again, we start looking at those countries, and there are discussions whether they are suitable because of their rule of law, whether they fit in with European standards. There's still a big shadow hanging over from Brexit. What will happen with new members? Will we have to revisit voting weights? Will Albania have the same vote as France? What about budget allocations, treaty changes? It could be politically very, very daunting. But strategically, it's quite urgent because, of course, enlargement and growth gives the EU a greater footing on the global stage, and it relies on its soft power stakes. And also there's a worry that if there's enlargement fatigue, if everyone just says, look, we're big enough as we are, then do we risk ceding our influence in those Balkan regions to potential rival powers across the globe? So each of these pressure points, they are interconnected in some way. Fiscal solidarity shapes trust in terms of migration. Unanimity can hamper sanctions and enlargement. Trade competitiveness affects the budget, that then affects cohesion. And the EU's challenge is to try to have a cohesive approach to all of these. So yes, just to stop on this for a second, if you wanted to get an update for 2025 on all of those issues, there's a short 30-minute video on the BFI updates YouTube channel where you can see the latest update on all of those challenges, maybe in a bit more detail to help you with your understanding. So we next come to the idea of the EU and how far is it globally integrated? What are the issues around global integration? And this famous moniker of the Brussels effect. Well, the EU is the world's, well, on this slide, we're basically going to look at how the EU fits into this broader picture and especially how it influences. Sometimes it dominates global standards. And that's what we mean by the Brussels effect. So we first need to remember that the EU is the world's largest single market, free movement, almost 400 million people. That scale alone means it has huge leverage in trade negotiations and the global market landscapes. That's its first foothold in globalisation. But it's not just about market size, it's got a strong influence on regulations, on transnational corporations and multinational businesses. Under this Brussels effect, countries worldwide frequently adjust their products and policies to meet our EU strict standards: privacy, consumer safety, environmental protection, digital standards, and things such as that. It means that the EU regulation can start to become a de facto global standard because firms don't want to produce different versions for different regions, and they don't want to lose access to this lucrative and maybe growing European market. And as a result, that gives the EU great influence. So sometimes people look at the EU Green Deal and say, well, the Green Deal, that's just Europe. It's not really going to affect anything on a global scale. Well, maybe it just might. And at the same time, the EU is fostering global integration by finalising trade agreements with countries around the world, providing development assistance, again, like we've just said, championing environmental and climate initiatives, and they can spur other regions. And this is what we mean by the EU's soft power. So certainly in terms of global integration, the EU is a big player. However, critics could argue that it can actually do the opposite and hinder global integration through its protective measures, like the cap, for instance, which makes it harder, as we've said before, for non-EU agricultural producers to compete. And likewise, some of the complexity of EU standards could be seen as an entry barrier for smaller businesses. And while we may be economically mighty here in the EU, we're not a traditional superpower. We do lack a unified military or foreign policy, and that leads to debates about just how far we will be able to exact any kind of global governance. And really, I think in your understanding, by linking the EU's large single market and its robust framework to the Brussels effect, on one hand, demonstrates your understanding of how and why EU rules can have a global influence. But it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And the EU facilitates integration in many areas, but retains policies that can be protectionist or fragmented. And for a top tier SAO, you should be well ready to acknowledge both those sides and get the detail to do that, highlighting the EU's successes, but also the limitations which often stem from those internal divisions. So we've covered how the EU is unique. It's not just a trade bloc, it's a political and social project with considerable reach. But as we've seen, it's riddled with internal debates and competing national interests. While it's got some of the attributes of a global superpower, such as its regulatory influence and its massive economy, it's not a complete power like the US, particularly in terms of foreign and defence matters. And balancing those points is crucial to understanding the EU's place in the globalised world. It's both a unifying force for its members, and at times it can be a bit of a stumbling block for faster global integration due to protective measures and some of those complex institutional processes. I think for big picture understanding, it's really important to see how it all fits together. So really, if we were to start at the top, we've got this integration of states and territories and regions together. And what that does is that both creates prosperity, but due to the core periphery model, it also increases the visibility of inequality and can risk deepening that inequality. So those disparities then generate a political demand for there to be some kind of and economic demand even for redistribution and development, which requires obviously that deeper integration to be financed and to be administered. And these policies then, as we move around, can maintain public support for this integrated system. So it becomes interrelated, but they are expensive. And as we've seen, that can lead to internal and external challenges. And what they do is those internal challenges, and especially maybe the external challenges, expose the EU's hard power deficit and show vulnerability because it has no unified military arm or unified, sometimes unified policies outside of the bloc. And therefore, the economic and regulatory power must carry more weight. So the EU must invest heavily in making sure they have that economic and regulatory leverage, which of course comes from the credibility of having a single market and cohesion. So you can see how it is a finely interrelated wheel, all of the topics we've looked at today. And you should think of it as a finely tuned wheel. Integration spins it, if you like, and the regional policy keeps it balanced. It can get wobbled by these shocks, and economic regulation, rather than its military muscle, gives it its outward clout. And if you removed any of those, you would find the whole mechanism would lose momentum. Okay, so I hope that's helped you to understand a little bit more. Theme 3, the EU, how it all fits together, and good luck with your studies.